Somewhere in Argentina right now, there are bones in the ground that belonged to an animal so large that when paleontologists first saw the femur, they measured it twice because they did not believe the number. 130 million years ago, a creature walked across what is now Patagonia that weighed more than 10 African elephants combined. It moved on 4 legs across solid ground. It breathed air. It had a heart that pumped blood 6 meters upward to reach its brain. Its neck alone was longer than a school bus. We have given it a name. We have partial bones. We have footprints pressed into ancient mud that are still there today. What we do not have is certainty about whether this animal, or something even larger, was the true record holder. This is the story of the largest land animals that ever existed, and the physics, the biology, and the sheer improbability of how they were possible at all. Before we go any further, if you find yourself genuinely surprised by what you are about to hear, please consider subscribing to this channel. We make these videos because this kind of deep natural history deserves to be told carefully and completely, and your support makes that possible. The problem with understanding how large sauropods actually were is that human beings are not equipped, either psychologically or experientially, to intuitively grasp the scale. We can read the number 70 tons and process it intellectually, but we cannot feel it the way we feel the size of a car or a house or even a large building. So, before we go any further into the biology and the physics and the paleontology, it is worth spending a moment on the comparisons that make the scale real, because the numbers alone are not enough. An African elephant, the largest land animal alive today, weighs between 5 and 7 tons. The largest elephant ever recorded, shot in Angola in 1956, weighed approximately 11 tons.
That animal was exceptional by the standards of its own species, a record that has not been approached since. Now multiply that by somewhere between 7 and 13, depending on which estimate you use for the largest sauropods, and you have the weight of Argentinosaurus, or Patagotitan, moving through the Cretaceous landscape of South America. The largest sauropods were not just bigger than elephants. They were bigger than a herd of elephants. They outweighed a fully loaded city bus by a factor of 10. They outweighed the largest military tanks. And they did all of this while standing on 4 legs, breathing air, maintaining body temperature, and apparently moving through their environment with reasonable efficiency for tens of millions of years. This was not a brief evolutionary experiment. This was a stable, successful biological strategy that persisted longer than the entire history of mammals as large animals. Now, here is the first thing that makes this genuinely complicated. When we ask what was the largest land animal ever, we are actually asking several different questions at once, and the answers are not always the same. Longest is not the same as heaviest. Tallest is not the same as either. And the honest answer to all of these questions is that we do not know with certainty, and we may never know, because the evidence is incomplete in ways that cannot be fully resolved by any amount of additional research on the material we currently have. The largest animals tend to leave the most frustratingly fragmentary fossil records. This seems counterintuitive, Surely a bigger bone is easier to find and preserve than a small one. And in some respects, that is true. But large animals also have lower population densities than small animals. There were simply fewer individuals alive at any given time, which means fewer opportunities for any particular individual to end up fossilized.
Additionally, the specific geological formations that preserve giant sauropod fossils are limited in their geographic extent and in the quality of their preservation. We are working with partial skeletons, isolated bones, and in some cases, single vertebrae or single femur bones, from which we must extrapolate the size of the entire animal using scaling relationships derived from more complete but smaller specimens. The uncertainty in these extrapolations is not a failure of scientific rigor. It is an honest acknowledgement of what the evidence actually tells us. The process of estimating body mass from fragmentary fossil bones is itself a subject of ongoing scientific debate, and understanding that debate is essential to understanding why the question of the largest sauropod remains contested. Different methods produce genuinely different estimates, and the uncertainty ranges can be enormous. Some researchers use volumetric methods, building three-dimensional digital models of the animal and estimating mass from the volume of the model and an assumed tissue density. This method requires making assumptions about the shape of soft tissues that are not preserved in the fossil record, and different researchers making different but equally defensible assumptions can arrive at estimates that differ by 20 or 30%. Other researchers use scaling relationships between bone dimensions and body mass derived from living animals, finding the mathematical relationship between, say, femur circumference and body mass in modern large vertebrates, and then applying that relationship to the fossil femur. This approach is more objective in some ways, but assumes that the scaling relationship in the extinct animal was similar to that in the living animals used to derive it, which is not guaranteed. A third approach uses biomechanical modeling to estimate the maximum mass that the skeletal architecture could have supported before bones would begin to fail under the animal's own weight. This gives an upper bound on possible mass, but not a precise estimate of actual mass. When you apply all three of these methods to the same fossil animal, you sometimes get estimates that differ by 30 or 40%. For an animal estimated at 70 tons, a 30% uncertainty means the true mass could have been anywhere between roughly 50 and 90 tons. That is an enormous range, representing the difference between an animal that was about 8 times the mass of the largest modern elephant and one that was about 13 times that mass. Both of those animals would be extraordinary. But they are not the same animal, and which one Argentinosaurus actually was matters for understanding the limits of terrestrial biology. With all of that firmly in mind, let us look at the main contenders. Argentinosaurus huinculensis, described in 1993 from bones found in the Neuquén province of Argentina, is perhaps the most famous candidate for the title of largest land animal ever. The known material includes several dorsal vertebrae, parts of the sacrum, a fibula, and fragments of other bones. The individual dorsal vertebrae alone are among the most impressive fossil bones ever found, reaching heights of nearly 1.5 meters. Just one of those vertebrae, placed on the floor next to a standing adult human, would reach past their shoulder. Estimates of Argentinosaurus's mass have ranged from around 50 tons to as much as 100 tons, with most current estimates clustering somewhere around 70 to 80 tons. But the critical point is that no complete skeleton of Argentinosaurus has ever been found. The reconstruction of its full dimensions requires significant extrapolation from the known bones and from comparisons with more complete but smaller relatives.
Patagotitan majorum, described in 2017 from the Chubut province of Argentina, is in some ways a better documented giant with a more complete fossil record, including bones from at least 6 individuals found at the same site. The Patagotitan material includes femurs, vertebrae, and various other skeletal elements that allow a more reliable reconstruction of the animal's proportions than is possible for Argentinosaurus. The femur of Patagotitan reached 2 meters and 40 centimeters in length, making it one of the longest limb bones ever discovered. Hold that number for a moment. A human femur is approximately 45 centimeters long. The femur of Patagotitan was more than 5 times longer. And femur length is not even the most impressive metric. The femur circumference, which scales more directly with body mass than length does, suggests a mass of approximately 69 tons for Patagotitan, making it comparable to Argentinosaurus by most estimates, though which animal was actually larger depends on which estimates you use and which reconstruction method you prefer. The discovery of Patagotitan was announced with considerable scientific and public fanfare, and a cast of its skeleton was installed in the American Museum of Natural History in New York. The mounted cast is so large that its neck extends out of the main fossil hall into the elevator lobby, requiring visitors to follow the animal around a corner to see it in full. This architectural challenge is itself a kind of tribute to the improbability of the animal. It is so large that the buildings we construct for human beings are not big enough to contain a full-scale representation of it. Other serious contenders include Puertosaurus, also from Patagonia, known from 4 vertebrae that are among the largest ever found, and suggest an animal potentially comparable to or exceeding Argentinosaurus. One of the Puertosaurus dorsal vertebrae is 1.68 meters wide, which is wider than most people are tall. Notocolossus, Dreadnoughtus, and Futalonctosaurus are other Patagonian titanosaurs that rank among the largest known sauropods. Dreadnoughtus, described in 2014, was initially claimed to be the most massive dinosaur whose size could be calculated with confidence, with an estimated mass of approximately 65 tons, though subsequent analyses have suggested the published estimate may be too high. The back and forth between different research groups over these mass estimates is not a sign that the science is broken. It is a sign that scientists are doing their jobs, challenging each other's assumptions and refining the methods. Outside of South America, Giraffatitan from the Tendaguru Formation of Tanzania was one of the tallest animals ever to exist, with extremely long forelimbs and an upwardly angled neck that gave it a reach no other land animal has matched. A mounted skeleton of Giraffatitan in the Museum für Naturkunde in Berlin is the tallest mounted dinosaur skeleton in the world, reaching approximately 13 meters in height. That is taller than a 4-story building. And in the Morrison Formation of the western United States, Supersaurus and Diplodocus were among the longest animals ever to exist, with total lengths potentially reaching 33 meters or more, though their mass was considerably less than the South American titanosaurs because of their more slender build. This brings us back to the distinction between longest and heaviest,
because it matters for understanding what kind of biological achievement we are actually talking about. Supersaurus, stretched out along the floor of the late Jurassic floodplain, was longer than Argentinosaurus. But Argentinosaurus was almost certainly heavier. Length is a measure of how much space an animal occupied.
Mass is a measure of how much biology it took to run the animal, how much food it needed, how much stress its bones were under, how hard its heart had to work, how much heat it generated and had to dissipate. Mass is the more revealing measure of biological extremity. And by the measure of mass, the South American titanosaurs of the Cretaceous were the most extreme land animals that ever lived. To understand why they were possible at all, you have to understand the world they lived in. The Cretaceous period, which ran from approximately 145 million years ago to 66 million years ago, was a profoundly different world from the one we inhabit. The climate was significantly warmer on average than today, with no permanent polar ice caps and a much smaller temperature gradient between the equator and the poles. Carbon dioxide concentrations were substantially higher than modern levels, perhaps 4 to 8 times higher, driving a greenhouse effect that kept global temperatures elevated across all latitudes. The shallow seas that covered large areas of the continental interiors were warm, productive, and extensive. And the land, while warm and vegetated, was covered with a flora that would be completely unrecognizable to modern eyes. Here is one of the most striking facts about the world of the giant sauropods. There was no grass. Not a single blade of grass anywhere on Earth during most of the Jurassic period, and only the very earliest, most primitive grasses beginning to appear toward the end of the Cretaceous. Too late and too sparse to have been ecologically significant to the largest titanosaurs. Grasses today cover approximately 40% of the world's non-glaciated land surface. They form the foundation of the most productive terrestrial ecosystems, from the African savanna to the North American prairie to the Asian steppe. Every large modern land herbivore, from the African elephant to the white rhinoceros to the giraffe, lives in a world shaped by grass. The sauropods lived in a world shaped instead by ferns, horsetails, cycads, ginkgos, and conifers. The vegetation was fundamentally different in its structure, its chemistry, and its nutritional profile. This matters for understanding sauropod feeding biology in ways that go beyond the obvious. Modern grasses are nutritionally efficient because they have been co-evolving with large herbivores for tens of millions of years, developing specific chemical and structural properties in the context of being eaten. The gymnosperms and ferns of the Mesozoic had not undergone this co-evolutionary refinement. They were, in many cases, tougher, lower in digestible protein, and higher in chemical compounds that serve as defenses against herbivory. They were also, in many environments, enormously abundant, forming dense, continuous vegetation across vast areas of warm, wet, carbon dioxide-rich Mesozoic landscape. The response of sauropods to this food environment was not to develop better teeth for grinding tough plant material. It was to abandon chewing almost entirely. This is one of the most counterintuitive aspects of sauropod biology, and it deserves a full explanation because it is central to understanding how these animals could sustain a 70-ton body. Modern large herbivores,
including elephants, rhinoceroses, and horses, invest heavily in dental machinery. They have large, complex grinding teeth with extensive surface area that mechanically break down plant material before swallowing, releasing nutrients that would otherwise be locked in intact plant cells. This chewing process is energetically expensive in terms of the muscular effort required, but it dramatically increases the nutritional value extracted from each kilogram of food.
Elephants spend up to 18 hours a day eating, but they extract considerable value from every mouthful. Sauropods did something different. Their teeth, where they had them, were simple pegs or rakes, clearly adapted for stripping leaves and needles from branches rather than for any kind of grinding or chewing. A diplodocus had a narrow skull with teeth only at the very front, functioning essentially as a leaf-stripping comb. A brachiosaurus had spatulate teeth, more suited for cropping vegetation. But neither of them had anything resembling the flat, grinding surfaces of a mammalian herbivore. They swallowed plant material essentially whole or in large, unchewed pieces, and relied on their enormous digestive tracts to process it. The key insight is that by not chewing, sauropods removed the bottleneck on food intake rate. A chewing animal can only eat as fast as it can chew, and chewing is slow. An animal that does not chew can eat as fast as it can strip leaves from branches, which is much faster. The trade-off is that the food arriving in the stomach is less processed and therefore harder to digest. But if you have a digestive system the size of a small building and a gut microbiome of fermentative bacteria capable of breaking down cellulose over many hours of slow processing, that trade-off can work in your favor. You compensate for lower per kilogram efficiency with dramatically higher intake volume, and the math works out if your body is large enough for the digestive system to scale accordingly. Sauropods were essentially walking fermentation vats, continuously processing enormous volumes of low-quality vegetation through a digestive system that operated more like a very slow, very large industrial composting system than anything in the modern mammalian world. The fermentation chemistry happening inside a large sauropod's digestive tract was not fundamentally different from what happens inside a modern cow or a modern termite mound. Microorganisms, primarily bacteria and archaea, break down the cellulose in plant cell walls by producing enzymes that cleave the chemical bonds holding the cellulose polymer together. The products of this breakdown are short-chain fatty acids, which the animal absorbs through the gut wall and uses as its primary fuel. The process generates heat as a byproduct, adding to the thermal budget of an already large warm body. It also generates methane, a gas that must be expelled, and the methane output of a population of large sauropods in a Cretaceous ecosystem was almost certainly a non-trivial contribution to the greenhouse gas composition of the Mesozoic atmosphere. A single large titanosaur may have produced hundreds of liters of methane per day. Multiply that by the population of titanosaurs across South America, and you have a biological feedback on atmospheric chemistry that climate modelers have only recently begun to take seriously. The gut microbiome of sauropods was almost certainly more complex and more specialized than that of any modern herbivore, simply because the food sources available to them, the gymnosperms and ferns of the Mesozoic, were chemically different from the grasses and flowering plants that modern herbivores have co-evolved with. Modern ruminants have gut microbiomes specifically adapted to the chemical composition of grass and flowering plant material,
refined over millions of years of coevolution between the herbivore and its microbial community. Sauropods were processing chemically different plant material, and their microbial communities would have reflected that difference. Some Mesozoic plants contained high concentrations of compounds specifically evolved as deterrents to herbivory, including terpenes, resins, and secondary metabolites that are toxic or digestibility reducing in large quantities.
The microbial communities in sauropod guts presumably included organisms capable of detoxifying or metabolizing these compounds, extending the range of plant material that the sauropod could safely consume. This co-evolutionary relationship between sauropod and gut microbiome was as important to the sauropod's survival as the mechanical design of its skeleton, and it is entirely invisible in the fossil record. The water requirements of a sauropod were correspondingly enormous. A modern African elephant in hot conditions can drink up to 200 liters of water per day. An animal 10 times the mass of an elephant, with a metabolic rate elevated by endothermy or near endothermy, would have water requirements that scaled at least proportionally and possibly more than proportionally with mass, given the additional water needed for the fermentation processes in the gut and the cooling mechanisms necessary to prevent overheating. Access to reliable water sources was almost certainly a major constraint on sauropod distribution and movement patterns. The trackways and bone bed sites that preserve the best sauropod fossil records are consistently associated with ancient river systems and lake margins, suggesting that sauropods congregated near water just as modern large African herbivores congregate near water sources in the dry season. In some environments, seasonal movement to track water availability may have been a regular part of sauropod behavioral ecology, potentially involving migrations of hundreds of kilometers, analogous to the great wildebeest migrations of the modern Serengeti, but conducted by animals 40 times the mass of a wildebeest. Some sauropods may have supplemented this system with gastroliths, stones swallowed deliberately to assist in mechanical grinding of plant material in the stomach, similar to the gizzard stones used by modern birds. The evidence for gastrolith use in sauropods is debated, with some specimens found with large collections of rounded stones in the stomach region and others showing no such stones, suggesting that the practice may have varied between species or individuals. Whether gastroliths were a systematic part of sauropod digestion or an occasional supplement remains an open question. But the possibility adds another layer to the picture of a digestive strategy fundamentally unlike anything in the modern world. Now we need to talk about the necks, because the necks are where the engineering becomes almost impossibly impressive. Sauropod necks ranged from the relatively modest proportions of some titanosaurs to the extraordinary elongation of the diplodocids and brachiosaurids. Mamenchisaurus, a Chinese sauropod from the late Jurassic, had a neck that may have reached 15 meters in length, more than half the total length of the animal. 15 meters is longer than a typical city bus. The neck of Brachiosaurus was held at a steep upward angle, giving it a total height of perhaps 13 meters, allowing it to browse from the tops of tall conifers that no other terrestrial animal could reach. The necks of diplodocids like Diplodocus and Supersaurus were more horizontally oriented, sweeping wide arcs through the vegetation at mid-height without requiring the animal to move its enormous body. Each of these neck configurations solved a different ecological problem. The high-reaching neck of Brachiosaurus accessed food resources that were simply unavailable to any competitor. No other animal in the Jurassic ecosystem could reach the tops of the tall conifers that Brachiosaurus fed on. This is ecological exclusivity through physical architecture. The horizontally sweeping neck of Diplodocus allowed it to process vegetation across a wide swath of ground while remaining stationary, reducing the enormous energetic cost of moving a 70-ton body.
An animal that can feed across a 10-meter arc without taking a step is saving a significant amount of energy compared to one that must walk to each new feeding position. In an animal with such enormous caloric requirements, these energy savings compound over the course of a day into a meaningful advantage. But holding up a neck of this length and mass posed biomechanical challenges that required extraordinary evolutionary solutions. The muscles running along the top of the cervical vertebrae were under constant tension, functioning like the cables of a suspension bridge, counterbalancing the weight of the neck against the pull of gravity. The ligaments connecting the vertebrae were specialized for sustained tension load-bearing rather than the dynamic loading that characterizes the ligaments of more mobile joints. And the vertebrae themselves were the most extraordinary component of the system, because they were not simply elongated versions of ordinary vertebrae. They were architectural marvels. This is where the pneumatization of the skeleton becomes the central story, and it needs to be understood clearly once, completely, because it is the single most important anatomical innovation that made giant sauropods possible. The vertebrae of sauropod necks and backs were hollowed out to a degree that has no parallel in any living land animal. Not just slightly lightened, hollowed to the point where some vertebrae had walls only a few millimeters thick, with the interior consisting almost entirely of interconnected air-filled chambers separated by thin, bony struts arranged in geometric patterns of remarkable structural efficiency. A large sauropod cervical vertebra might be 80% air by volume. The bone material was concentrated precisely where structural analysis shows maximum stress occurs, and removed entirely from the low-stress regions. This is not random biology. This is what millions of years of selection for weight reduction in a structure that must remain strong produces. Something that looks, when you examine the internal geometry, almost indistinguishable from the internal structure of a modern aerospace component designed by engineers who had the same problem to solve. The air spaces in the vertebrae were not simply empty. They were connected to a system of air sacs that extended throughout the body, analogous to the air sac system of modern birds. And this is the connection that makes everything else make sense. Because the air sacs were not just lightening the skeleton, they were the mechanical component of a respiratory system fundamentally different from anything in the mammalian world. Mammals breathe in a tidal pattern. Air flows in, partially exchanges with the blood in the lungs, and then flows back out the same way it came in. The result is that the gas in mammalian lungs at any given moment is a mixture of fresh inhaled air and stale residual air that has already given up some of its oxygen and accumulated carbon dioxide. The gas exchange is therefore never happening in the presence of maximally fresh air. Birds, and by extension non-avian dinosaurs including sauropods, evolved a different solution. Their respiratory system is unidirectional. Air flows continuously in one direction through the lungs, from the posterior air sacs through the gas exchange surfaces, and then forward into the anterior air sacs before being exhaled. The result is that the gas exchange surfaces are always in contact with fresh, maximally oxygenated air. The efficiency of this system is substantially higher than mammalian tidal breathing, particularly at the high metabolic rates that a large, active animal requires.
The combination of a more efficient respiratory system and pneumatized bones that both lighten the skeleton and housed the air sac components of that respiratory system was the engineering package that allowed sauropods to exceed the body size limits that mammalian physiology imposes. Modern elephants, running on mammalian tidal breathing and solid bones, are approaching the upper limit of viable body size for their physiological toolkit. Add the avian respiratory system and the pneumatized skeleton, and the ceiling rises dramatically. The sauropods found that ceiling and pushed against it. And then came the circulatory problem. Because pneumatized bones and efficient lungs solve the respiratory side of the equation, but they do not solve the problem of getting oxygenated blood from the lungs to the tissues. And in an animal with a neck 6 or 8 meters tall, this problem is severe. To push blood upward through a neck of this height against the hydrostatic pressure of gravity requires extraordinary cardiac force. A giraffe, which faces a version of this problem with a neck of only about 2 meters, has evolved a heart weighing approximately 12 kilograms, nearly 10 times the proportional heart size of a similarly massed non-giraffe mammal, and blood pressure at the heart level that would cause a stroke in a human being within seconds. The vascular system of a giraffe has specialized pressure regulation throughout the neck, with thick-walled arteries, venous valves, and a specialized network of blood vessels at the base of the brain called the rete mirabile, that acts as a pressure buffer, preventing the brain from being damaged when the animal raises or lowers its head. Now scale that problem up by a factor of 20 in body mass and triple the height differential that the heart must overcome. The cardiac demands of a large Brachiosaurus were almost certainly beyond what a single 4-chambered heart of proportionally normal size could manage. Estimates of sauropod heart mass based on simple scaling from giraffe physiology suggest a heart that might have weighed several hundred kilograms. Some researchers have argued for even larger values, approaching a ton for the largest titanosaurs. Others have proposed that sauropods must have had auxiliary pumping mechanisms distributed along the neck, thickened arterial segments that contract rhythmically to assist the main heart in pushing blood upward. Others have argued that sauropods actually carried their necks more horizontally than traditional reconstructions suggest, reducing the hydrostatic pressure differential. The debate is not resolved, and it may never be fully resolved, because the soft tissues that would answer the question definitively did not fossilize. What we can say with certainty is that sauropods existed. Therefore, the engineering problem was solved, and therefore, there exists a biological solution to the problem of pumping blood 6 meters upward through a living neck. We just are not entirely sure what that solution was. This is one of the most fascinating aspects of working at the boundaries of what biology has actually achieved. The evidence that a thing is possible is the thing itself, fossilized in the rock. But the mechanism of its possibility remains partially hidden. The metabolic demands of these animals bring the story to its next level of strangeness. For most of the 20th century, dinosaurs were assumed to be ectothermic, cold-blooded like modern reptiles, dependent on external heat sources to maintain body temperature. This assumption felt natural given that dinosaurs were classified as reptiles,
and modern reptiles are cold-blooded. But it turned out to be almost certainly wrong, at least for sauropods, and the evidence against it comes directly from the bones themselves. Bone microstructure records growth rate.
A bone growing rapidly deposits a specific type of tissue called fibrolamellar bone, characterized by a disorganized, fibrous matrix laid down quickly. A bone growing slowly deposits more organized, lamellar tissue. Modern reptiles, which grow slowly and ectothermically, have bone dominated by slowly deposited, organized tissue. Modern birds and mammals, which grow rapidly and endothermically, have bone dominated by fibrolamellar tissue. When paleontologists cut thin sections of sauropod bones and examined them under polarized light microscopes in the 1980s and 90s, they found fibrolamellar bone throughout, exactly what you see in a rapidly growing, warm-blooded animal, not the slowly deposited reptilian tissue. The rapidly deposited tissue of an animal with a high metabolic rate and fast growth. This evidence was initially controversial. Sauropods as warm-blooded animals seemed to raise as many problems as it solved, not least the problem of where the heat went. A 70-ton endotherm generates enormous amounts of metabolic heat, and in a warm Cretaceous climate with no polar cold to radiate heat into, dissipating that heat without overheating was a genuine physiological challenge. Some researchers proposed a middle ground, calling it mesothermy or inertial homeothermy, a strategy in which an animal with a relatively modest metabolic rate per unit mass maintains stable body temperature partly through the sheer thermal inertia of its enormous body. A very large body loses heat so slowly that even a modest metabolic rate, substantially below that of a modern mammal of equivalent mass, would be sufficient to keep core temperature stable against normal environmental fluctuations. The Komodo dragon and the leatherback sea turtle use versions of this strategy today, though neither approaches the size of a large sauropod. This mechanism, sometimes called gigantothermy, could have allowed sauropods to maintain stable, elevated body temperatures at lower metabolic cost than full avian or mammalian endothermy would require. The isotopic composition of sauropod bones and teeth has added another line of evidence. The ratio of oxygen isotopes in bone mineral reflects the temperature at which the bone was formed. By measuring oxygen isotope ratios at multiple points in a sauropod bone, researchers can estimate not just average body temperature, but temperature variation across the body. Studies using this technique have found that large sauropods maintained relatively stable, elevated core body temperatures, consistent with endothermy or gigantothermy, but that the temperature variation across the body, from core to extremities, was smaller than in modern large reptiles and comparable to that in modern large mammals. This is evidence for active thermoregulation, not just passive warming from a hot climate. The food requirements that followed from this physiology were staggering. A modern African elephant consuming roughly 150 to 200 kilograms of vegetation per day is running an ectotherm-adjacent metabolism relative to what the sauropods needed. Estimates of daily food consumption for large sauropods vary widely, depending on assumptions about metabolic rate, digestive efficiency, and food quality. But the range consistently falls between several hundred kilograms and over a ton of plant material per day.
At the higher end of these estimates, a large Argentinosaurus needed to process more than its own body weight in vegetation every few months just to maintain itself. Not to grow, not to reproduce, just to exist. Finding and consuming that quantity of food was the central activity of its life, the organizing principle around which all other behavior revolved. This is what drove the evolution of the long neck more than any other single factor.
Not reaching tall trees, though that was a real benefit. Not accessing food sources unavailable to competitors, though that was also real. The primary driver of neck elongation in sauropods was energetic efficiency. An animal that can feed across a wide arc without moving its massive body is burning fewer calories per kilogram of food acquired than an animal that must walk to each new feeding position. The energetic cost of moving a 70-ton body even a single step is enormous. A long neck that allows the animal to sweep through 10 meters of vegetation without taking that step is a direct metabolic saving, repeated thousands of times a day, compounding into a significant energy budget advantage. The neck was not just a feeding tool. It was an energy conservation device at the scale of a creature whose energy budget was measured in tons of plant matter per week. Now consider the reproductive strategy that this body size demanded. And here is where the story takes its most surprising turn. Because these animals, weighing 60 or 70 tons, reproduced by laying eggs. Not large eggs, not proportionally large eggs. Eggs roughly the size of a volleyball, 15 to 20 centimeters in diameter. The largest known sauropod eggs are about the size of a human head, representing perhaps 3 or 4 liters of volume, containing an embryo that would hatch at a weight of perhaps 4 or 5 kilograms. 4 or 5 kilograms out of a 70-ton adult. The hatchling weighed less than 1/10,000th of the adult mass. This is not a ratio that exists anywhere in the modern world. A human baby is approximately 1/20th of adult mass. A blue whale calf is about 1/60th of adult mass. The sauropod ratio of 10,000 to 1 is in a completely different category, and understanding it requires understanding why the eggs were so small. Eggs cannot exceed a certain size without creating insurmountable problems for gas exchange. The embryo inside an egg breathes through the shell, and as the egg gets larger, the ratio of shell surface area to egg volume decreases, making it progressively harder to supply enough oxygen to the interior. The physics of diffusion through porous shell material sets a hard upper limit on how large an egg can be while still being able to oxygenate the embryo inside. A sauropod egg, the size of the animal's proportional share of its body mass, would have been so large that the embryo inside would have suffocated before hatching. The small egg size was not a choice. It was a constraint imposed by the physics of gas exchange, and the entire reproductive strategy of sauropods was built around working within that constraint. The consequence was that sauropods produced large numbers of small eggs, relied on the environment for incubation rather than guarding the nest, and invested essentially no parental care in individual offspring. Nesting sites found in Argentina,
India, and other locations show dense concentrations of sauropod eggs, sometimes hundreds in a relatively small area, laid in shallow depressions or buried in vegetation mounds where microbial decomposition would generate the heat needed for incubation. Multiple females appear to have used the same nesting sites repeatedly, returning year after year, creating aggregations of eggs that paleontologists have interpreted as evidence of colonial nesting behavior. After the eggs were laid and buried, the adults appear to have moved on. The hatchlings emerged into a world where they were entirely on their own. A few kilograms of vulnerable protein in an ecosystem full of predators much larger than they were. The mortality rate in the first few years of a sauropod's life must have been extraordinary. A hatchling Argentinosaurus was a perfectly appropriate meal for dozens of species in its environment, from small theropods to large lizards to early crocodilians.
The strategy was not to protect individual offspring, but to produce so many of them that enough would survive despite the losses. This is the same reproductive strategy used by sea turtles, by most fish, by frogs. Make many small offspring, accept that most will die, count on sheer numbers to ensure that a few survive to adulthood. Applied to an animal that will eventually weigh 70 tons, it produces one of the most extreme developmental trajectories in the history of life. Which brings us to the growth. And this is where the numbers become almost mythological in their scale. A hatchling Argentinosaurus weighed approximately 5 kilograms. The adult weighed somewhere between 60 and 80 tons. That is a mass increase of between 12,000 and 16,000 times over the course of a single lifetime. To put that in the context of the natural world, a human being increases its mass from birth to adulthood by a factor of approximately 20. A blue whale, which starts as a 2.5-ton calf and grows to 150 tons, increases its mass by a factor of 60. The sauropod growth multiplier is not a larger version of these numbers. It is a different category of biological phenomenon entirely. And it happened fast. Not fast by human standards, but fast by the standards of an animal growing to 70 tons. Bone histology, the study of bone microstructure that we mentioned earlier in the context of metabolic rate, provides a direct record of how quickly individual sauropods grew. The fibrolamellar bone tissue that characterizes sauropod bone is not just evidence of high metabolic rate. It is evidence of rapid growth. The specific pattern of tissue deposition, the density of blood vessel channels, the organization of the collagen matrix, all of these microscopic features encode information about how fast the bone was being laid down at different stages of the animal's life. By reading this record carefully, paleontologists can reconstruct growth curves, showing how body size changed over time for individual animals. Those growth curves show something remarkable. Juvenile sauropods in their fastest growth phase were adding mass at rates of several kilograms per day. Several kilograms per day. A young Argentinosaurus growing at peak rate was adding more mass in a single day than a hatchling weighed in total. This pace of growth is comparable to the fastest growth rates seen in modern large animals, including the blue whale calf, which grows at an extraordinary rate during nursing. But unlike the whale calf, which is being supported by its mother's extremely rich milk,
The growing sauropod was eating ferns and cycad The metabolic machinery required to convert tough Cretaceous vegetation into several kilograms of new bone and muscle per day was operating at an intensity that defies easy comparison with anything alive today. The growth rings visible in sauropod bone sections, laid down annually like tree rings in wood, allow researchers to count the age of individual specimens directly. A bone section from a large individual shows a series of rings, each representing 1 year of life, with the spacing between rings recording the growth rate that year. In young animals, the rings are widely spaced, reflecting rapid growth. As the animal approaches adult size, the rings become more closely spaced, reflecting decelerating growth. And in the oldest individuals, the rings may be extremely closely spaced or fused together, reflecting the near cessation of growth in an animal that has reached or approached its maximum size. What these growth records show across multiple sauropod species and multiple specimens is that most individuals died before reaching maximum adult size.
The largest specimens, the ones that give us our size records, were exceptional survivors that had lived long enough and successfully avoided enough predators, disease, and accidents to reach sizes that most members of their species never achieved. The bones of Argentinosaurus and Patagotitan represent the far tail of the size distribution of their species, the individuals that survived longest and grew most. The average individual of these species was considerably smaller. And here is the implication that makes the record setters even more impressive. Many of the largest known specimens still show open growth plates, meaning they had not yet stopped growing at the time of their death. The theoretical maximum size of these animals, reached only by individuals that survived to very old age, may have been larger than anything we have found. There may be bones still in the ground in Patagonia that, when found, will revise upward our estimates of the maximum size achieved by land animals. The geological formations that have produced the giant titanosaurs are not fully explored. Remote areas of Argentina, the Congo Basin of Africa, the Gobi Desert of Mongolia, all contain Cretaceous age sediments that have yielded sauropod material but have not been systematically surveyed. The history of paleontology is full of records being broken by new discoveries, and there is no particular reason to think that the current record holders represent the true maximum. The largest land animal that ever lived may still be in the ground, waiting. The social lives of sauropods, while difficult to reconstruct from fossil evidence, left more traces than is often appreciated. Trackway sites, where the footprints of multiple individuals moving in the same direction at approximately the same time have been preserved in ancient hardened mud, provide the most direct evidence of social behavior. At several Morrison Formation sites in the western United States, trackways show groups of sauropods of different sizes moving together, with the largest individuals on the outside of the group and smaller individuals in the center. This arrangement, if it reflects genuine group structure rather than coincidental overlap of tracks made at different times, is consistent with protective herding behavior, in which adults shield juveniles from predators by surrounding them.
Similar trackway evidence has been found in Jurassic deposits in Portugal and Cretaceous deposits in Bolivia, suggesting that herding behavior, if real, was widespread across different sauropod lineages and geographic regions. The acoustic environment of a sauropod herd would have been remarkable. Low-frequency sound travels further than high-frequency sound, and very large animals with large resonating chambers in their skulls and nasal passages are capable of producing extremely low-frequency vocalizations that carry over great distances. Modern elephants communicate using infrasound, sounds below the threshold of human hearing that can travel several kilometers through the ground and air. Sauropods, with skulls and nasal passages scaled up by a factor of 10 relative to elephants, could potentially have produced vocalizations of even lower frequency and even greater range. These vocalizations could have served functions including maintaining contact between herd members, advertising reproductive status, warning of predators, and coordinating group movement. The functional complexity of a sauropod social communication system, if it existed, could have been considerable, operating on sensory channels largely invisible to human observers without specialized equipment. We have no direct fossil evidence for sauropod vocalizations, but the anatomy is consistent with the capacity, and the ecological logic strongly favors it. The geographic distribution of sauropods through the Mesozoic world tells its own story about how these animals responded to the slow-motion geography of plate tectonics. In the early Jurassic, when sauropods were first diversifying into large body sizes, the southern supercontinent Gondwana was still largely intact, and sauropod faunas across its different regions were closely related. As Gondwana fragmented through the Jurassic and Cretaceous, the separating land masses carried their sauropod populations with them into isolation, and evolutionary divergence followed. South America, which separated from Africa during the early Cretaceous but remained isolated from North America by the seaway that occupied the Isthmus of Panama until very late in the Cretaceous, developed the most distinctive and, in terms of maximum body size, the most extreme sauropod fauna. The isolation was complete enough and lasted long enough that the titanosaur lineage in South America evolved along trajectories not seen elsewhere, producing body sizes that the connected Northern Hemisphere faunas never matched. Africa's sauropod record, dominated by the Tendaguru fauna of Tanzania, represents a different evolutionary trajectory, shaped by different isolation patterns and different vegetation. The Tendaguru beds, deposited during the late Jurassic in what was then a coastal environment on the eastern margin of the fragmenting Gondwana, have produced some of the finest sauropod specimens in the world. Giraffa titan, the remarkably tall brachiosaurid from Tendaguru, represents an evolutionary solution to the problem of accessing tall food sources that is architecturally different from the titanosaur solution. Rather than emphasizing mass and bulk, Giraffa titan emphasized height, with forelimbs substantially longer than its hind limbs and a neck angled steeply upward, giving it a silhouette more like a biological crane than anything in the modern world. The mounted skeleton in Berlin, reaching 13 meters at the top of its raised head, makes the giraffe at 6 meters seem like a scaled-down model of what a tall, browsing animal can actually be. North America's Morrison Formation sauropod fauna, deposited between approximately 155 and 148 million years ago, represents a different ecological arrangement again, one where multiple large sauropod species coexisted in the same formation by partitioning the food resources along axes of height and vegetation type. Diplodocus and Apatosaurus, the long, low-slung diplodocids, likely fed on low-growing ferns and ground-level vegetation, sweeping their horizontal necks through the understory. Brachiosaurus, with its high-reaching neck, accessed the tops of tall conifers unavailable to the diplodocids. Camarasaurus, with its more robust dentition compared to the delicate peg teeth of Diplodocus, may have specialized in tougher vegetation that the more gracile browsers could not efficiently process. This ecological partitioning, spreading the feeding pressure of multiple large sauropod species across different vegetation types and height zones, is analogous to the partitioning of food resources among the large herbivores of the modern African savanna. It represents a sophisticated ecological community structure, not a random assemblage of large animals competing for the same resource. But why did they get so large in the first place? This question has occupied paleontologists and evolutionary biologists for decades, and the answer that has emerged is not a single factor, but a convergence of multiple advantages that stacked together to make extreme gigantism not just possible, but actively favored by natural selection. Large body size in herbivores provides improved digestive efficiency for low-quality food, because a larger gut volume means longer retention time and more complete fermentation. It provides reduced vulnerability to predation, because at a certain size, there simply are no predators capable of killing you. It provides thermal stability through the giganthermy mechanism we discussed earlier. And it provides access to food resources unavailable to smaller animals, whether that is the tops of tall conifers accessible only to a Brachiosaurus, or the wide feeding arc enabled by a long neck. There is another advantage of large body size in herbivores that is less often discussed, but may have been particularly important in the Mesozoic context: the ability to physically access and process food sources that smaller animals cannot use at all. Modern elephants regularly push over large trees to access the nutrient-rich cambium layer beneath the bark, or to reach leaves and branches that are otherwise out of reach. They strip bark from living trees with their trunks. They dig for water and mineral-rich soil with their feet and tusks. These physically destructive feeding behaviors are only available to an animal large enough to exert the necessary forces. Sauropods, with bodies weighing 60 to 70 tons, could exert forces on their environment that no smaller animal could approach. They could lean against large conifers and bring them down. They could strip entire branches from trees by pulling against them with their neck muscles. They could excavate soil with their forefeet to access mineral-rich subsoil that smaller herbivores could not dig to. The physical force available to an animal of this mass was itself a feeding tool, allowing access to resources invisible to smaller competitors. The relationship between sauropod body size and predation pressure is another dimension that shaped the evolution of gigantism in ways that create a fascinating evolutionary dynamic. The largest adult titanosaurs had no predators, not because predators did not try,
but because an animal weighing 60 or 70 tons and standing 4 or 5 meters tall at the shoulder was simply beyond the capability of any predator in its ecosystem to kill. Giganotosaurus carolinii, the largest theropod predator known from South America during the time of the giant titanosaurs, reached lengths of perhaps 12 to 13 meters and masses of perhaps 6 to 8 tons. That is an impressive animal by any standard. But attacking an adult Argentinosaurus was almost certainly not a viable feeding strategy for Giganotosaurus, any more than a wolf pack today would attempt to kill a healthy adult elephant. The risk of injury from a single kick of a 7-meter leg was prohibitive, and the energy expenditure of a sustained attack on an invulnerable target was simply not worthwhile. Where Giganotosaurus and its relatives Mapusaurus and Tyrannotitan likely focused their predatory attention was on juveniles and subadults, the individuals in the 10 to 30-ton range that were large enough to provide a substantial meal, but not yet large enough to be effectively invulnerable. The existence of Mapusaurus in particular is interesting in this context, because specimens of this large theropod have been found in bone beds suggesting group living, or at least gregarious behavior, which has led some researchers to propose that Mapusaurus hunted cooperatively, with multiple individuals working together to bring down prey too large for a single predator. Whether this represents true cooperative hunting in the sense that wolves or lions hunt cooperatively, involving coordinated tactics and shared spoils, or simply opportunistic scavenging by multiple individuals at the same carcass, is debated. But the suggestion that large Cretaceous theropods may have evolved social predatory behavior specifically in response to the extreme body sizes of their titanosaur prey is a compelling example of evolutionary arms race dynamics operating at the scale of the largest animals on Earth. The implication for sauropod evolution is that natural selection strongly favored rapid growth through the vulnerable juvenile size range. An individual that grew faster spent less time at the sizes most vulnerable to predation, improving its probability of surviving to reproductive age. This creates a powerful evolutionary pressure for the high growth rates that bone histology documents, not just as a consequence of high metabolic rate, but as a direct adaptation to predation risk. The most rapidly growing individuals were the most likely to survive, and their offspring inherited both the metabolic machinery for rapid growth and the genes for large adult body size that the rapid growth produced. The predators were, paradoxically, part of the mechanism that drove sauropod body size to its extreme values, by creating selection pressure for faster growth and therefore for the physiological systems capable of supporting it. In the specific ecological context of the Mesozoic, with low-quality gymnosperm vegetation that rewarded high intake volume, no grasses to support the rapid cycling digestive systems of mammals, warm climate that reduced the energetic cost of maintaining body temperature, and a predator fauna that created strong selection pressure for large body size as a defense strategy, all of these advantages aligned. The result was a positive feedback loop. Larger body size provided advantages that favored survival and reproduction. Survival and reproduction to old age produced even larger individuals, and the largest individuals enjoyed the greatest advantages. Selection drove body size upward for millions of years until some other factor set the ceiling.
That ceiling was set by the square-cube law, the fundamental geometric relationship that describes how physical properties scale with size. And understanding it
is essential to understanding why there was nothing larger than the giant titanosaurs. As a body's linear dimensions increase by a factor of 2, its volume and mass increase by a factor of 8, but its cross-sectional area, and therefore the load-bearing capacity of its bones, increases by only a factor of 4. This means that as an animal gets larger, the stress on its bones per unit of cross-sectional area increases in proportion to its linear dimensions. Double the animal's length, and the bone stress per unit area doubles, even if you scale the bones proportionally in all dimensions. At some size, the bones reach their material strength limit and begin to fail under the animal's own weight. Sauropods escaped this constraint through the pneumatized skeleton, which reduced mass without reducing structural cross-section, and through posture and locomotion strategies that minimized peak bone stress. Their columnar limb posture, with the legs held directly beneath the body rather than sprawled to the sides as in lizards, placed the limb bones primarily in compression rather than bending, and bone is much stronger in compression than in bending. The cushioning pads on their feet distributed impact forces across a large area, reducing peak stress at any single point. These adaptations raised the ceiling of viable body size beyond what would have been possible with mammalian physiology and bone structure, which is why the largest land animals in Earth's history were dinosaurs rather than mammals, even though mammals have been present and diversifying for 66 million years since the dinosaur extinction. No mammal has come close to the size of the giant titanosaurs, the largest land mammals that ever lived, the giant intricatheres of the Oligocene, relatives of the modern rhinoceros, reached perhaps 15 to 20 tons. That is extraordinary by modern standards, larger than any elephant alive today. But it is a quarter of the mass of Argentinosaurus, or less. The mammalian respiratory system, the mammalian bone structure, and the mammalian metabolic strategy together impose a size ceiling that has never been broken in 66 million years of mammalian evolution, and never approaches what the sauropods achieved. The sauropods were not just the largest land animals that ever lived. They were large in a way that the mammalian body plan is fundamentally incapable of replicating. And we are living in the aftermath of their extinction, in a world that will never again see their like walking across it. The asteroid that ended them, the Chicxulub impactor that struck the Yucatan Peninsula 66 million years ago, did not single out sauropods. It ended the ecological world that had supported them. The continuous Mesozoic vegetation, the warm, stable climate, the high productivity landscapes that could support an animal eating hundreds of kilograms of food per day. In the darkness that followed the impact, as photosynthesis collapsed and the food chains built on it unraveled from the bottom up, an animal with the food requirements of a large titanosaur had no options. You cannot reduce your metabolic demands when your metabolic machinery is built into your physiology. You cannot eat less than your biology requires. The sauropods did not go quietly into that darkness. They simply reached the point where there was not enough food left to sustain them. And then they died. And the world they had built their biology for died with them. The birds survived, and this deserves to be said clearly. Birds are dinosaurs. Not metaphorically, not in the loose sense of shared ancestry. Birds are, in the formal biological sense, a lineage of theropod dinosaurs that passed through the extinction event
and diversified into the roughly 10,000 species alive today. They survived because they were small, because they could eat seeds that persisted in the soil during the years of darkness, and because some could enter torpor to reduce metabolic demands during food shortages. None of those escape routes were available to a titanosaur. But the survival of birds means that the dinosaur lineage is not extinct. It is singing in the trees outside your window, navigating by a magnetic field across continents, diving after fish in every ocean. The sauropods are gone. Their avian descendants are not. What we are left with is a world that is, in a specific and measurable sense, less extreme than the world that existed before the impact. The largest land animal alive today weighs approximately 7 tons. The largest land animal that ever existed weighed approximately 70 tons. That is a factor of 10 reduction in the maximum body size that terrestrial life achieves. We are living in the diminished aftermath of the Mesozoic, a world where the upper limit of what walks on 4 legs has been reset downward by an order of magnitude and has shown no sign of recovering in 66 million years. The study of sauropod biology has itself undergone a revolution in the past 20 years that mirrors the revolution in our understanding of dinosaurs more broadly. For most of the 20th century, sauropods were reconstructed as slow, swamp-dwelling animals that spent much of their time partially submerged in water, using the buoyancy of the water to support their enormous weight. This reconstruction was driven partly by intuition, the reasoning that an animal this large must need water support to move, and partly by the specific geological contexts in which many early sauropod finds were made, in river and lake deposits that suggested aquatic environments.
It was wrong on both counts. Biomechanical analysis of sauropod limb bones shows that they were fully adapted for terrestrial locomotion, with the columnar limb posture and foot anatomy of an animal that spent its life on solid ground. The geological contexts of sauropod bone beds reflect not the preferred habitat of the animals, but the specific environments where carcasses were most likely to be buried and preserved, which are precisely river margins and lake shores. The sauropods were not swamp creatures. They were terrestrial animals of the highest order, and the image of Diplodocus wading through a Jurassic lake with most of its body submerged belongs to the same category of outdated paleontological mythology as the tail-dragging Tyrannosaurus and the cold-blooded, sluggish dinosaur in general. The revision of sauropod posture and locomotion changed the entire picture of their ecology. A terrestrial sauropod, moving actively across the landscape at 4 to 8 kilometers per hour, covering substantial distances in the course of a day's foraging, was a very different ecological actor than a swamp-bound animal barely moving between feeding bouts. Estimates of the daily distance traveled by large sauropods, derived from trackway analysis and energetic modeling, suggest that these animals could have covered 10 to 20 kilometers per day during active foraging, and potentially much more during seasonal movements to track food and water availability. Over the course of a year, this translates to a home range of potentially hundreds or thousands of square kilometers for large individuals. The ecological footprint of a population of titanosaurs in terms of geographic space, vegetation consumed, and physical landscape modification was on a scale that has no modern terrestrial parallel. The physical impact of sauropods on their landscapes deserves particular emphasis, because it is easy to think of these animals as passive consumers of vegetation, when they were actually
active modifiers of their ecosystems on a scale comparable to modern large disturbance agents like fire and flooding. A herd of large titanosaurs moving through a forested landscape compacted soil with footsteps, leaving 40-centimeter deep impressions, knocked over trees in the process of feeding, created open gaps in forest canopy that changed the light environment for understory plants, dispersed seeds and spores of the plants they fed on across large distances through their digestive systems, and deposited enormous quantities of nutrient-rich waste that fertilized the soil and created patches of elevated plant productivity. The Mesozoic landscape was not a backdrop against which sauropods lived. It was shaped by them, continuously, for 150 million years. The plants, the soils, the hydrology, the microhabitat structure of Mesozoic terrestrial ecosystems all bore the imprint of sauropod activity, in the same way that modern African savanna ecosystems bear the imprint of elephant activity, but amplified by the greater mass and longer evolutionary tenure of the sauropods. The extinction of the sauropods removed this ecosystem engineering force from the terrestrial world, and the consequences rippled through the recovering Paleogene ecosystems in ways that are difficult to quantify, but almost certainly significant. The Paleogene forests that developed after the extinction, in the absence of 70-ton animals pushing over trees and creating canopy gaps, developed differently from the Mesozoic forests that had been shaped by sauropod disturbance for 150 million years.
The mammals that colonized the post-extinction landscape found a world where the vegetation structure, the soil characteristics, and the landscape heterogeneity had all been reset by the catastrophe and were reorganizing in the absence of the dominant ecosystem engineers that had shaped them. The world the mammals inherited was not the world the sauropods had created. It was the wreckage of that world, slowly rebuilding itself according to rules that no longer included the participation of the largest terrestrial animals that ever lived. The ecological conditions that allowed sauropods to exist, the warm climate, the gymnosperm vegetation, the specific combination of atmospheric chemistry and continental configuration that made the Cretaceous possible, are gone. And the mammals that replaced the dinosaurs have never found an equivalent pathway to comparable gigantism. This is the deepest lesson of the sauropods. The world we inhabit is not the default state of this planet. It is one specific configuration, shaped by the contingent catastrophe of 66 million years ago, that happens to favor the biology of small, fast-reproducing, endothermic mammals over the biology of slow-growing, enormously large, pneumatically lightened dinosaurs. In a different world, one where the asteroid missed, sauropods might still be walking the Earth today, and the primates that gave rise to us would still be small, nocturnal, ecologically insignificant creatures hiding in the undergrowth beneath animals they could not possibly challenge. We exist in the ecological space that the extinction created. The sauropods existed in the ecological space that the Mesozoic created. Both are real. Only one is still here. And somewhere in the rock of Patagonia, there is a bone that a farmer has not yet noticed sticking out of a cliff. When someone finally measures it, they may measure it twice, because the number will not seem possible. And then they will measure it a third time and publish the result, and the record will move again. And we will be reminded once more that the boundary between the possible and the impossible in the natural world is always further out than we think, and that the largest chapter in the history of life on this planet was written not by anything alive today, but by animals that carried their impossible bodies across the ancient earth on 4 legs, heading somewhere, leaving footprints in the mud that we are still finding and still measuring and still struggling to believe.